the structures, the governmental structures that were created to deal with the challenges of the industrial era, the industrial Gilded Age, are not up to the task of the challenges that are coming at us so fast in the digital Gilded Age. I mean, I'll give you an example. So, when I was chairman of the FCC, I was enforcing an act that was written in 1934.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please tell a friend, and we'll keep sharing great conversations like the amazing one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And of course, the added bonus, you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact. Joe McKendrick writes this week in Forbes Online that the most profound career shift in a generation is upon us, thanks to AI. In a recent study of 1,000 business users commissioned by SnapLogic, 81% said growing their understanding of AI is essential for their careers. 50% are already using AI for research and 21% for coding tasks. 68% said they don't know enough about generative AI to take advantage of it at work. McKendrick goes on to say the effects of the AI revolution are still uneven. In the short term, we can expect the biggest impacts in education, law, communication, and other types of knowledge work. That's where we're going to see a lot of changes quickly. In the more medium term, manufacturing, logistics, supply chains, and other fields will also change, not just because of AI, but because other innovations will overlap with AI, like the Internet of Things, predictive analytics, and even 3D printing. Now, this article is interesting. It's nothing we haven't heard before, but a good reminder that every employee in every field should be thinking about reskilling and upskilling to take advantage of AI. It will soon be ubiquitous in the workplace. And as always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. Now, shifting to this week's conversation. Tom Wheeler served as the 31st chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. After being appointed to the role by President Obama in November 2013, his chairmanship has been described as the most productive commission in the history of the agency. Prior to that, he was a venture capitalist and, among other roles, the CEO of the Cellular, Telecommunications and Internet Association, or CTIA, which is where we first met in 2001, which feels like a lifetime ago. He's the only person to be elected to both the Cable Television Hall of Fame and the Wireless Hall of Fame, which led President Obama to quip that Tom Wheeler is the Bo Jackson of telecom. Additionally, he's an award-winning author, a sought-after speaker about topics ranging from leadership to net neutrality, and a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. I could share more about Tom's accolades, but we then have no time left for today's discussion. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Tom Wheeler to AI and the Future of Work.
It's nice to see you again. We ought to, every 22 years or so, we ought to make a point to get together, right?
I'll put it on my calendar. So good to have you on the program. I've really been looking forward to this one. I shared a bit about your background. Let's get started by talking about Techlash, the new book that was just published weeks ago, and what inspired you to write it.
Well, I am a guy who has been fortunate enough to spend his professional life at the intersection of public policy and new technology. And if that was my vocation, my avocation was that I'm a history buff. And so I always tended to see things in their historical context. The book that I wrote immediately preceding this was called From Gutenberg to Google, The History of Our Future. And then this book tries to look at the challenges that we're living through today. And, you look back and you go, wow, those are echoes of what we saw during the Gilded Age. And today we're evolving into a digital environment. In the Gilded Age, they were evolving into an industrial environment, and the effects and consequences are very much the same. The question is, will the decisions to protect the rights of individuals and the public interest also be the same?
I end up reading a lot of books as preparation for these interviews, and I've got to say yours was the most thought-provoking and well-researched. And I don't say that lightly. I really enjoyed the analogy between the Gilded Age, a term, as you well know, was coined by Mark Twain, kind of post-Civil War, and maybe through the early bits of the 20th century. You made me think about the parallels. Maybe get started just for our audience, share some of the key themes from the book in terms of the parallels between the Gilded Age and what you're calling kind of the new Gilded Age or the digital age.
Well, Dan, if you look back on the original Gilded Age, it was an era that was shaped by new technology, that drove new products, that changed economic behavior and the behavior of individuals, that accelerated the pace of life, that created monopolies, that resulted in the destruction of small local businesses, that created great wealth disparity, consumer harms, and even fake news. Now let's see. Look at that list. Does that sound familiar? And we're living through the same kinds of changes today. And so that was the trigger that got me going down this path that I write about in Techlash, and who makes the rules in the digital Gilded Age. Because when you look back at the original Gilded Age, the rules were being made by the innovators and their investors. One of my favorite quotes from that period was the financier J.P. Morgan, who said that men who own property can do with it as they wish. And you go, oh my goodness, talk about making the rules. And then you stop and think, well, that's not terribly dissimilar to Mark Zuckerberg's famous move fast and break things, because what are you breaking? You're not breaking physical object. You're breaking the old patterns that provided stability. And why are you moving fast? You're moving fast so that you can get those new patterns inculcated before people really understand them. And I'm going, my goodness, J.P. Morgan and Mark Zuckerberg are saying the same thing. The difference is that ultimately we the people, rose up and said to our elected representatives, you need to do something about this. And so all kinds of landmark legislation was introduced. The first federal regulatory commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, was created to oversee the abuses of the railroad. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed to deal with monopolies. The Pure Food and Drug Act was passed to make sure that products were safe. And I could go on and on and on and on. But the fact of the matter is that ultimately in the original Gilded Age, guardrails were put in place to protect consumers and the marketplace. And capitalism thrived after that. The question is, are we going to see that same kind of guardrail ideas being adopted in the new Gilded Age? Or are we going to continue the pattern that has existed for the last several decades of how the innovators make the rules that the rest of us have to live by.
The pathways that the property owners, as you referenced in the JP Morgan quote, had access to in the original Gilded Age were quite literally the physical railways that transported goods. And so they had a lot of control over the means of production because they controlled the railways. And we all know what impact that had on labor and implications for broader society. What does it mean when the new era of capitalists, you referenced Zuckerberg, have access to digital pathways that obviously are, unlimited in terms of scope, what they can transmit? They're transmitting your personal data instead of some physical goods.
Right.
What are your thoughts on how that gives this kind of new Gilded Age version of the JP Morgan capitalist perhaps access to more power or more control that could potentially be used in nefarious ways versus the JP Morgans?
It's a great question, Dan. And I in Techlash, I try to talk about it in terms of the digital virtual cycle, if you will, where the platform companies end up or start out capturing your private information and my private information and making it a corporate asset. Okay, so it's a huge, there's an alchemy here between it. So it moves from your private information to a corporate asset. And again, back to who makes the rules. And remember in 2010, Mark Zuckerberg announced unilaterally, privacy is no longer a social norm. And therefore, he was going to rewrite the algorithms to capture as much information as possible. So if that data, and data, as you well know, you live this life, data is the capital asset of the 21st century. And if that data about you and me is hoarded by one of the digital platforms, it then allows them to control the marketplace, because the asset that is necessary for competition to exist in that marketplace is denied to others. So you've got privacy that evolves into a lack of competition or an absence of competition. But then once you control the market, you also control the information that goes across that market. And so you get into a situation where there is a direct connection between the infringement on your personal privacy into the destruction of competitive marketplaces and into the delivery of misinformation and disinformation. And of course, every time you click on one of those pieces of information that is being shown to you, that creates more information about you that starts the whole process all over again.
So as a fellow history buff, I've got to get your take on this one. So the original Gilded Age was named for the kind of thin veneer of gold
Right.
that was layered on top of those who were essentially made subservient by those who owned the gold, so to speak, or were in control of that thin veneer. Talk us through, how did those who were, call it oppressed, maybe that's a strong word, but by those with access to capital, how did they get out from, rise above that thin veneer of gold? And then what can we learn from that example, as we enter, as you've noted very well, a pattern where there's similar relationships between the capitalists and those who are controlled by them in the new Gilded Age?
Well, they organized. Okay, and we all know how workers organized for worker safety, fair compensation, etc. One of the stories that we know less about, however, and is talked about in Techlash, is how the farmers organized to try and curtail the abuses of the railroads, because the railroads were the farmer's route to market, right? And traditionally, a small town had one railroad. And that railroad operator said, I've got a monopoly. You're going to pay whatever it takes for me to carry it. And they'd carry the wheat or the cattle or whatever to a central point like Chicago, where suddenly it would be put on main lines where there was competition. And guess what? It suddenly became cheaper to transport where there was competition. And so the farmers in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War, farmers began organizing, and that was when the Grange was founded. And farmers began organizing and saying, you have to do something about the power of the railroads and how we're being abused. And it wasn't until 1887, 20 years later, that the Interstate Commerce Commission was created to deal with that issue. But there were results, if you will. And so there's a couple of messages here. Never give up. Okay. Now, life moves a lot faster than it did in the 19th century. And we're probably not looking at a 20-year interregnum. But the fact of the matter is the farmers hung in there for 20 years and went through different kind of permutations and combinations of, well, we'll try things at the state level. That didn't work. And ultimately got the regulation and the oversight that the marketplace needed to encourage the expansion of agriculture, and just like workers got the protections they needed to assure that they were safe on the job, and just like consumers got the protection they needed from tainted food that was produced in this new industrial environment. We're in the same kind of a situation. And what we need to be doing is to be having the same kind of, we're fed up, we're not going to take it anymore. This is not about destroying the companies, because I mean, I think you said at the outset, I've been an entrepreneur. I was a venture capitalist. I'm a capital C capitalist. But capitalism works best when it operates inside guardrails that protect against inherent excesses.
So I've got to drill into that a little bit more. Great answer, by the way. So the modern equivalent of that farmer is everyone. And the modern equivalent of the wheat or the corn that was being shipped on the railways is our personal data. If we extend that analogy, this idea of organizing to be able to aggregate our power and change the rules, it goes well beyond Starbucks workers or Hollywood screenwriters or even auto workers, because it's everyone and it's our personal data. What does it mean to organize when it's all of us and all of our data?
And that's the right question. And there was a poll that was done by Pew Research just in the last few months that said that 68% of the American people didn't trust big tech to self-regulate. And the fascinating thing was that was true across both political parties and across conservatives or liberals. Everybody felt that way. Now, hopefully, the elected representatives of those people will begin to get that message, and I think they are. When I was chairman of the FCC, the message that I was constantly getting from elected representatives was, the internet is really close to magic, and don't you dare touch it because you'll break that magic. And it was because it was something new. It was something that they didn't understand, and they were happy to sit back and let others make the rules. And I think everybody now understands the consequences of that. I mean, how many times a day, literally, do you hear various elected officials say, well, we didn't act soon enough on social media when it first developed, and we can't be doing that same thing on AI. And so I think everybody is awakening to that fact. And I think, frankly, that the kinds of things that you're engaged in, that AI is itself the trigger for an awareness of a need to do something, not just about AI, but about the things we've been sweeping under the rug for the last couple of decades. So I'm hopeful. I'm also a realist that the legislative process is fraught. It's always easier to kill something than it is to pass something. But people speaking out is what will change the day today in the digital Gilded Age, just like it did in the original Gilded Age.
You oversaw what was called the most productive commission in the history of the FCC. So clearly, if anyone is deputized to think about, the potential for regulatory agencies to regulate this medusa that is the new Gilded Age, it would certainly be you. But yet, coming from the cradle of Silicon Valley, I see the lack of regulation and the pace of development of regulation as being a phenomenal way for big tech to exploit the ownership of the means of production today. And I talk frequently on this podcast about what it means to exercise responsible AI, because although I'm an optimist, I believe that the forces of capitalism ultimately prevail. And I'm afraid that if we expect, whether it's, what comes from the Biden administration's executive order on AI or other things that are going through the pipeline, if we rely on those slow-moving activities to regulate big tech, we essentially give some of these organizations, maybe a decade to be able to define the policy on their own, or what I called when we were prepping, grade their own homework. That's a slightly cynical view. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
No, I don't think it's cynical. I think it's logical. And the reality is that the structures, the governmental structures that were created to deal with the challenges of the industrial era, the industrial Gilded Age, are not up to the task of the challenges that are coming at us so fast in the digital Gilded Age. I mean, I'll give you an example. So, when I was chairman of the FCC, I was enforcing an act that was written in 1934, before television broadcasting, and trying to figure out how do you interpret that act in the digital environment. And so one of the things that I advocate for in Techlash is we need to leave behind industrial era regulatory models and embrace a new digital era regulatory model. And let me just develop that a minute here. So when the Congress went to create agencies like the ICC, like the Federal Trade Commission, etc., in the original Gilded Age, they looked around and they said, well, what's the management model that is being used by the companies that we intend to oversee? And industrial management was a very top-down, rigid, sclerotic, rules-based structure. The guru, the management guru of the time was a fellow by the name of Frederick W. Taylor. And he wrote a book called Scientific Management, in which he talked about the way in which you get the most productivity out of your workers is to squeeze out every bit of initiative. And so we're surprised that the agencies that were created using that kind of a management model are themselves sclerotic, rigid, and have a hard time dealing with the new realities. So let's jump forward now. We jump to the new digital Gilded Age. And what's the management model of the digital companies? Well, it's based on transparency. It's based on risk analysis and agility. You know, every time your smartphone downloads new software, you're seeing an example of modern, agile, digital management. So what I am suggesting is that just like we cloned the management techniques of those we wanted to oversee in the industrial era, we now need to be cloning the management techniques of those we want to oversee in the digital era, and to have a more flexible, more agile, able to keep pace with change kind of regulatory oversight. And that's, I think that means that we need to have a new federal digital platform commission, and it needs to be operating in a new structure. And that's what we all ought to be pushing for.
As a person who has seen how legislation gets enacted, drafted, et cetera, and why the process takes a long time, and it's a very thoughtful process for good reason, because you might end up inheriting regulation that spans many decades or could go back to as far as 1934. How do you, as an insider, think that I love the term agile digital management? How do you change the rules in Washington to become agile? That's like the antithesis of what the adjectives that I would typically use to describe the pace of change in DC.
That's correct. But I think also this is not only the people who are going to have to do this, but the companies themselves are going to have to say, okay, I'm going to quit this attitude of, I'll meet you at the fence with my shotgun and oppose every regulation. And the fascinating thing to me is I think there are two forces that could drive that to happen. One is what's happening abroad in the European Union and the United Kingdom, where they have been much more aggressive in their oversight of digital technology. And those practices, because the world is interconnected now, those practices end up having an impact here, number one. Number two is that the companies, I think, ultimately get to a point where they say, no, wait a minute, I want a common set of rules, not something that is made by this country or that country, and an absence of rules in the United States. So the one thing that corporate executives hate is uncertainty. And so let's have some certainty in what the rules are. The first foray of the Europeans was the GDPR, the General Data Protection Rule, which is their attempt at privacy. That was not perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. And lo and behold, when California goes to develop its own privacy rules for the state, what do they base it on? They base it on the GDPR. There are now, I think, 16 states of the United States that have their own privacy rules that are rooted in GDPR. And even China, when they come up with their privacy rules, rooted in the GDPR. So I think that at some point in time, the companies say, hey, we need consistency so that we can operate in this large interconnected market. Secondly, I find it fascinating that the companies who are, you might call big AI, are the same companies that were opposing earlier digital regulation, and they're now out saying, "Oh, we need some kind of regulation." And I think that's a breakthrough. And we can argue about whether their approach is the right approach or not. But the fact of the matter is, we're finally talking about it rather than shaking fists at each other. So again, that gives me some optimism that I mean, I know from personal experience that legislation passes when there is agreement on multiple sides that, hey, we have to do something. And then it becomes, okay, how do we come up with something that's mutually livable?
Tech executives hear regulation, and instead of hearing what you and I hear, which is safety and the responsible practice of innovation, AI, technology, they hear it's a tax on innovation. How do we achieve the intended effects of regulation without stifling innovation?
Well, of course, all regulation is a tightrope that stretches between protecting consumers and competition and having an impact on innovation. I mean, I must say, Peter Thiel came up with this concept of permissionless innovation, which nobody that I know of, and I know that certainly when we were in office, we weren't trying to say that you're like the Food and Drug Administration, that you have to give you permission before you can offer a product. But it was a great buzzword that I discuss in Techlash, and I call it the big con. And the big con was, as I said before, that, oh, this digital is so complex. I mean, we're seeing it again in AI. You know, I watched Eric Schmidt on Meet the Press a few weeks ago, and they were talking to him about regulating AI, and his message was, "Oh, it's too complex. Nobody in Washington can understand it, and you have to let the industry make its own rules." And I'm scratching my head and I'm saying, well, let me just think here. The government did split the atom. The government did run a program that took men safely to and from the moon. Yeah, it's complex. And yes, few members of Congress are generalists. They're not steeped in technology or any other thing. But you know, I doubt if there are a half a dozen members of Congress who can explain jet propulsion, let alone, you know, Bernoulli's principle that keeps airplanes in the air. But we regulate the manufacture of aircraft and we regulate the use of aircraft. And I think this whole thing about, oh, nobody in government could possibly understand it, is the big con. It's the excuse as to why you do nothing and you let us, the innovators and our investors, continue to make the rules.
Best rationale I've heard ever for the role of federal regulation and why we should be optimistic about positive outcomes. Now, unbelievably, Tom, we're about out of time. This is one where I wish we could go on for hours. Offline, we may have to continue it, but I'm not letting you off the hot seat without answering one last question for me.
Uh-oh, here it comes.
It's an important one, all right? I was holding this one back.
This is like Columbo, all right? Just one more question.
Look, it took us 20 years to reconvene. I'm convinced, or I'm committed to making sure it's not that long. So I'm going to ask you, we're having another version of this conversation. And let's say instead of 2023, it's 2028. Are we more or less safe as consumers? Or where are we at in terms of regulation, consumer safety? How has this dialogue evolved in the next 5 years?
Well, I lost the Windex to my crystal ball. But let me just, since you and I are both, frustrated history buffs, let me just answer that with a thought. We have no control over what history hands us, but we do have control of the future. And the story that I tell in Techlash is that in the original Gilded Age, society was confronted by never before seen challenges, industrial challenges, and they responded with never before seen solutions. And I think that is how we define our future, that we are looking at never before seen digital challenges. And just like those who preceded us, we've got to be able to come up with new, never before seen solutions. And whether we are able to do that and how we do that will answer your question.
I said that was the last question, but one last, very last one. Tom, are you prepared to announce your candidacy for president on this podcast? Because if you do, I'm signing up to be your campaign manager.
Gee, Dan, I thought you had better judgment than that. But thank you very much.
Hey, this has been a pleasure. The book is called Techlash: Who Makes the Rules in the Digital Gilded Age? Barack Obama recently featured it on his 2023 list of what I'm reading on the rise of artificial intelligence. Tom, you're a national treasure. I hope you'll come back frequently. Let's make sure it's not another 20 years, all right?
That's a deal. Thanks, Dan.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from People Rain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.